At his very first Federal Executive Council meeting, President Bola Tinubu has given marching orders to the ministers of his cabinet, while insisting that the present administration inherited a bad economy with an inflation rate of 24% and unacceptably high unemployment. The Tinubu administration has unveiled an 8-point agenda based on 8 priority areas with identified targets that are expected to be delivered in the next 3 years. There will be a lot of focus on Wale Edun, the finance minister and coordinating minister of the economy, as well as Dr. Doris Uzoka Anite, Minister for Trade and Investment, and Dr. Bosun Tijani, Minister for Telecommunications and the Digital Economy, to see how their ministries drive economic growth and work to bring in foreign direct investment. Joining me now is Dr. Andrew Nevin, economist and former partner and chief economist for PwC Nigeria. Dr. Nevin, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you.
So one thing we keep hearing about is the kind of economy that the Tinubu administration inherited. And with the recent data released by the MBS, we saw inflation, headline inflation, jumping to 24.08%. Food inflation is now 26.98%. So, Andrew, let's start from laying out really the state of the economy that the Tinubu administration now needs to work to rebuild.
Well, I think everyone in the country understands a very difficult economic situation. I'll say our position when I was at PwC, my position now was, the 2 major causes in the latter years were, one was insecurity, which really affects everything, but particularly agricultural production. So then you end up with food inflation because people are not producing enough food because simply it's insecure to do so. The other major driver of the poor economic performance was the reduction in hydrocarbons. So when I arrived in the country, it was over 2 million barrels a day of hydrocarbons, dipped down to 1.7 back around 2014, 2015. It got as low as 1.0. That puts immense pressure on the exchange rate and on the FX, as we all know. And of course, that drives inflation too. So the economic situation when His Excellency President Tinubu came in, as he rightly says, is very, very difficult. But that's not news to anyone in the country.
Very true. So we know that the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Wale Edun, who was addressing journalists after the FEC meeting, noted that the government was not in a position to borrow money at this time, but would rather focus on creating a macroeconomic environment where both local and foreign investors would be able to increase production and also invest. So, Andrew, we've had conversations around this borrowing situation, and inherently, as many analysts and economists like yourself agree, borrowing in and of itself is not a bad thing. But we also have to realize at this point in time, following the FX unification, Nigeria's debt profile has risen to about 81 trillion naira. And then just a few days ago, the president also noted that the country cannot continue debt servicing with 90% of our revenue. But let's look at this precarious situation we all agree Nigeria is in. How much fiscal space is there for the Tinubu administration to operate in? Is borrowing completely avoidable for this administration?
Well, I think the country will continue to borrow. And of course, despite all of the problems we've had over the years, years and years ago, I used to say we didn't have a debt problem, we didn't have a revenue problem, we had a growth problem. That continues to be true. We need higher growth. But the number that you just cited, 81 trillion naira, it sounds like a lot because we work in trillions of naira, hundreds of trillions of naira in the Nigerian context, because the naira is, individual value is quite low. But it's a 300 trillion naira economy. So when you say 81 trillion naira, it says 25% of GDP, which is actually by global standards and even developing market standards is very low. So, I don't think that there's a debt problem. I think that what His Honorable Minister Edun Wale is correct about is, and I'm sorry, I'll turn my phone off in a second, you can hear in the background, but what he's correct about is, we shouldn't be borrowing more than we need to at this point. And I think one of the prime problems in the economy that I've spoken about over the years, of course, is the incredible dead assets that we have. There are so many assets that are absorbing resources from it and driving up the borrowing. Things like Ajaokuta Steel, the refineries, the airport in Lagos, which is large, the new terminal, which is very international, which is largely not used. So he's absolutely right. Borrowing is not a solution to this. What's the solution to this is growth. So what are the policies that are going to grow the economy? And then revenue and borrowing will just take care of themselves.
Interesting enough, on this borrowing issue, I've heard it said that the situation is not just a case of Nigeria having limited space to borrow, but also a case of Nigeria may be not finding enough people to even borrow Nigeria money. Do you think Nigeria has sort of gotten to maybe a pariah state when it comes to this conversation around being borrowed funds, whether it's by countries like China that we know what we've seen them do on the African continent, or even institutional lenders as well? Are people still even interested in borrowing Nigeria money?
I think so. I mean, I think people are still optimistic about Nigeria after the election. I mean, literally the day of the inauguration of His Excellency, we got an uptick. I was still at PwC at the time, still in Nigeria. Then we got a big uptick in foreign investor interest in it. Of course, when he made the bold pronouncements about the FX policy and the foil subsidy, that piqued a lot of interest that he was prepared to do bold things. So I don't think we're a pariah. I mean, the other thing, of course, is the government's announced that many of these assets that they have, they're actually going to have a partial privatization, which is something that we've advocated for years. So you take NNPC, you sell some proportion of it. It could be as little as 10% or 20%. I think the government's come out and said sell a majority. I'm not sure that's the right policy as a first step. But anyway, whatever the amount is, that does a few things. It raises revenue, reduces your debt, and improves the governance of the organization, hopefully the return to Nigeria. So I'm not worried that we're a pariah state. I think that we're only a couple of months into this administration, maybe 3 months now. There's been a lot that's going on. And we've had good appointments, particularly the Honorable Minister of Finance and Coordinator for the Economy, I think is an appointment that's widely viewed as very positive. So I don't think we're a pariah state. We're not nearly in the same kind of difficulty that Ghana, which you talked a little bit about, having to do a debt swap. The IMF has not been called in. And as I've always said over the years, I mean, it's an enormously rich country. It has all these assets. It's just the assets are structured in a way they're not producing a return at the moment. So this is eminently fixable.
So just quickly staying on this borrowing matter before we move ahead, if Nigeria is to borrow under the Tinubu administration, what do you think should be done differently? Or do you think we've learned any lessons from the Muhammadu Buhari years and, of course, how the former president left the state of Nigeria's debt profile?
Well, I think the number one thing is or maybe two things. One is address these dead assets. So let's start with Ajaokuta Steel. I mean, there was a recent announcement, the federal government, I'm not sure if it was under His Excellency President Tinubu or under His Excellency President Buhari, but I think it was under His Excellency President Buhari. It spent $400 million regularizing in a legal sense Ajaokuta Steel so it could be rehabilitated. Now you have to ask yourself, this is a steel mill that was put in place in the 1970s. It's never produced a ton of steel. What kind of state is the physical asset in? It was built in the wrong place in the country because you have to have hundreds of miles of track to bring in the iron ore from a different part of the country. So it was built in the wrong place. I'm not sure it has any real value, economic value, even though we keep pretending it does. And yet the government put in another $400 million into it. And that's the kind of thing that has to come to a halt with this new administration. I think there needs to be some difficult decisions around all these dead assets. What's the path forward for each one that can maximize the benefit for the Nigerian people? Again, to take the refineries, we've had another promise. I think it's the Warri refinery, maybe get to it. It's hard to keep track. That would come on stream by December 2023 on that. And of course, His Excellency, the President's come out and said, people don't deliver, heads are going to roll. So there's been promises about this refinery. There's been billions of dollars put into it. If it doesn't come on stream, what are the consequences? One, for what we do with the refinery, but also for the individuals that are being responsible for it. So what the President said at the FEC, I think is very important. He said, you're not in the minister role because for political patronage. I mean, obviously you had to choose some political supporters in these critical roles, but if you don't perform, we're going to move you out. And I think him acting on that is going to be a very important signal to both the Nigerians, but also people around the world that the administration is serious about the economy.
And I like the fact that you talk about individuals, because the president did also address his ministers. We've said he's given them marching orders, but he also said, don't be afraid to ask questions and don't be afraid to come to me. So we've identified 3 ministers that we think are going to be quite pivotal to the Tinubu administration's attempts to revive the economy. We've talked about Wale Edun as well, a minister of finance and coordinating minister of the economy. His responsibilities will encompass driving economic growth and fostering foreign direct investment inflows. There's also the Minister of Trade and Investment as well. She's also going to command, or she already commands, a portfolio that's critical for attracting foreign direct investments. And the third is one that has been a bit controversial, but we also know that he's holding a portfolio, again, with the president's direction for the digital economy, with such collaborations with people like Google, that's going to be quite pivotal. And that's, of course, the Minister for Telecommunications and the Digital Economy. And we're going to expect these three ministers to not only hold their portfolios very strongly, but also to collaborate when it comes to the direction they want to take Nigeria. Now, I know you probably know a bit about each and every one of them, but when it comes to individuals and these three main individuals that will help the president to drive his economic focus, what do you think? Do we have the round pegs and round holes, as Nigerians like to ask?
Well, I think definitely in the case of the Honorable Minister for the Finance, Budget, and National Planning and Economic Coordination, I think is an excellent choice. I think people listening know his background. He's been in the private sector a long time, has had a great deal of success on that, understands how the economy works. I think it's a fantastic appointment. Dr. Boson, of course, I know, I think that's a really fantastic choice because it sends a signal. We have a young, dynamic person who's in that role, and I've been speaking for years about the role of the digital economy. Just to put some numbers on it. We don't have more than 10 million people employed in the formal sector in Nigeria, but there's going to be 42 million programmers in the world in a few years by 2030, and every one of those jobs is available to a Nigerian, and it's happening already very quickly. And as you said, it's very important that the federal government and the Honorable Minister interact with people like Google, people like Microsoft, but also the indigenous outsourcing companies. So a company like Outsource Global that I've talked a lot about, led by the amazing Amal Hassan. I know there's a new digital strategy that NID has been working on, really to make Nigeria an outsourcing hub. There's, I think, 2 million outsourcing jobs, high-value outsourcing jobs in India. There's 1 million in the Philippines. There should be many more Nigerians, millions of Nigerians. We put the number 2 million as well for Nigerians that work remotely in high value-added global value chains, but they stay in Nigeria. So this is to reverse the JAPA. And of course, a lot of it, in Mal's case, in the case of Outsource Global, these are jobs in northern Nigeria. So we're very concerned about development of the north. So I think those are two fantastic appointments. The Honorable Minister of Industry and Trade, I know less about. I know she's also, though, from the private sector, I believe, on that. And I trust that the Honorable, His Excellency the President has made a good choice in this case as well. But getting them all working together is very important on that. One thing I'll mention, of course, is my ex-colleague and brother Taiwo Awodele now chairs the taxation committee. And one of the issues, for example, for Dr. Boson is if you're going to have a digital economy, you've got to have access to bandwidth. And we have 33 taxes, levies, and charges for the telecoms industry, issues around the right of way. I know that in Dr. Boson's in-tray, Honorable Minister Boson's in-tray, that the issues around that are going to be right at the front and center. So it's not just the three of them working together with the president and actually the vice president is also working together with the other actors, but particularly the fiscal framework. And I suspect, Taiwo, of course, is very vocal about what was needed by the government, even when he was critical of the government. The fact that he's been chosen for this important role shows the government's serious about doing the things that needed to be done in the fiscal space.
And very true, because we've spoken to Taiwo many times on this issue around taxation, taxing, rather widening the net and making sure that those who are in the middle and upper class are paying their fair share and reducing some of the pressure that you get on those on the lower end of the divide. So we've spoken to him since he's had this appointment as well, and we look forward to speaking to him throughout the course of his higher national call to see exactly what reforms we're going to see.
Let me just say one thing about the taxation, though. One thing that I've said, and I'll repeat again, is I think it is a mistake to keep talking about resource mobilization at the present time. So if you think about what we've just said, so the federal government has shown for the last, really all the time I've been in Nigeria, but particularly the last 8 years, that it cannot use resources wisely. Ajaokuta Steel, the cost of governance, the 3 refineries, the national stadium, the air terminal in Lagos, as I said, many of the intervention programs, anchor borrowers, mass metering, they have not delivered value to the Nigerian people. So it never made sense to me to be saying, repeating these statistics, we only collect a small amount of tax revenue to GDP, so therefore we have to collect more. Why would you go out and say we're going to collect more tax revenue until you show that the resources that you already take are used wisely? So in terms of ordering, what I would really like to see the federal government do is show the Nigerian people it can use the resources wisely. When the Nigerian people read about or hear about every senator getting 2 million naira as a little vacation bonus for the leave, when they hear about the armored vehicles, when they hear about the number of aides and the cost of governance, when they hear about Ajay Steel, they're simply saying to themselves, the federal government can't use the resources wisely. So in that circumstances, just in the ordering of it, I think it's very critical the federal government shows it can use resources wisely. And then it can broaden the tax net and widen the tax net and increase the resources. But when people see value, they're prepared to pay.
Yeah, very true. So, Andrew, of course, we need to talk about the 8-point agenda that was also unveiled, and it shows what the administration wants to target when it comes to the economy. So the priority areas are food security, ending poverty, economic growth and job creation, then access to capital, particularly consumer credit, and inclusivity in all dimensions, particularly as it regards youth and women, improving security, improving the playing field on which people and particularly companies operate, rule of law, and of course, fighting corruption. The truth of the matter is all of these are interwoven, and we can't address one without addressing the others. We can't succeed with one if there are failures in the others. Now, when you look at these priority areas, do you have some level of confidence that the administration is facing the right things and facing the right direction in addressing these issues? When we talk about security, I want to bring this in quickly because you mentioned the crude oil production as well. The fact that the numbers have continued to fall and we've struggled to meet upwards of 2 million barrels per day. Yes, it's part of security, but do you also think, given the fact that Nigeria continues to still be very dependent on its revenue from crude oil, it should also be a priority area on its own?
Well, when I interacted with members of the administration before they took office, I was very clear to me there were the two biggest economic issues were, one, the insecurity, which had that knock-on effect on everything, but particularly agricultural production and food inflation, which really hurts everyone and of course increases poverty. And the second was the increase in production of hydrocarbons. And it's sad to see what happened. Of course, I think in June, so the first month after the new administration, the production was 1.3 million barrels a day, which was an improvement, not nearly good enough. Mm-hmm. But yet in July, it fell back to 1.0. So that was really disheartening, and we continued to have this immense pressure on the exchange rate. So I think getting the hydrocarbon production back up to me was one of the two biggest priorities. I mean, obviously, all of the 8 points are important, but I would start with the insecurity and with the hydrocarbon production, the two things that really in the short term, through some progress, would make a big difference and set a platform for doing all of the things that the government wants to do, but it's a very good outline. That 8-point plan doesn't include something else, of course, that the new administration has said it will do, which is implement the Orange report. And this goes to this issue about showing you can use resources wisely and the cost of governance. Of course, people know the Orange report was done in 2013. And it advocated the merger of certain functions, the elimination of MDAs that were not added value, and was very specific about it. It probably needs to be updated because we've moved on for about 10 years. But that also has to be part of the plan for it is part of the plan for the new administration. On the fighting corruption, I mean, I think people know when I speak, I'm not an expert in corruption. We all understand, though we did write the paper, I think 8 or 9 years ago at PwC about the immense cost of corruption, the total cost of corruption to the nation. That continues to be true. In that particular area, as I said, I'm not an expert, but I haven't really seen much in the first few months of the administration that would show that they've made this a priority. So it'll be interesting to see if the next few months that emerges with some really concrete action. I mean, particularly because, and I won't name any, but some of the people chosen for minister positions were ones that are dogged by corruption charges at the moment.
And it's a lot to take on. It's a very precarious place that Nigeria finds itself, as we said earlier. There's a lot of work to be done. We've seen a 3-year timeline for this administration. When it comes to even roadmaps and some of the milestones, we look forward to hearing more about that. But I want to take you on something we've previously spoken about before President Tinubu became president. Now, the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, Dr. Doris Anise, said that the president plans to create 50 million jobs. A lot of times right now, the question is, How? What's the potential of the creative industry, the digital economy, the Greek sector, even agro-processing zones, mining, oil and gas? But let's even be very specific towards this digital creative economy. We also now have a minister for the creative economy. We have a minister who's going to be focusing on that area. People are a bit apprehensive because they understand sometimes when government gets involved, that's where taxation comes in, that's where levies come in. But when it comes to this creation of 50 million jobs, focusing on digital, focusing on creative, partnering with people like Google, where do you think is going to take us? And a lot of people are asking how. Andrew, do you see a way forward with this?
Well, let me start out just addressing agriculture for a minute. I mean, obviously, a lot of these jobs should be created in agriculture, agricultural value chains. My observation, I know many people who as individuals have taken on roles in trying to improve agriculture, particularly in their home state. So they might be a successful businessman, someone who works, or businesswoman. In many cases, they might work in a bank or the telecoms company, but on the side, they are trying to develop agriculture. But the biggest impediment has been the insecurity on that. And I've had a number of people tell me they started successful agricultural programs doing chickens or raising cassava, looking at palm oil, and then they've had to shut down because of insecurity. So I think that is addressable, and there are natural forces to really drive agriculture. My own view is we don't need things like anchor borrowers, which I said has been unsuccessful. We just need security to reduce, and then we'll create millions of jobs in agriculture. And there are many actors out there that understand the critical role of agricultural processing. I mean, it's obviously from an economic viewpoint much better to process something here in Nigeria than try to import it through our port infrastructure, our road infrastructure at the moment. So that is poised to take off if insecurity is addressed, in my view. In terms of the digital economy, I mean, we wrote the paper that really put this on the map that said, look, this is the number one thing that Nigeria should be doing to increase exports. We can't really export physical goods, physical manufactured goods anytime in the medium term for reasons we all understand. It's not our comparative advantage. But we're already exporting services. I cited Outsource Global, tech experts. Of course, the global companies are hiring more and more Nigerians in Nigeria who are exporting services around the world for them. And we put our paper out on that and said the potential of 2 million jobs. I think that's an underestimate. I just gave numbers for India and the Philippines a little bit earlier. So, and of course, the creative industry fits into that as well. And so having these digital industries thrive, I mean, it just gives a much bigger access to the market. As I said, there's only 10 million formal jobs in Nigeria. People compete for these jobs. They all want a job with the government. If they had access to the skills, they now have access to this much wider global job market because of the technology, because of the fact with COVID, we have much better ways of working together and much more trust in remote working on that. So it's eminently feasible. So for me, in terms of driving exports, there's three things the government should focus on. One is the hydrocarbons, as I said. Number two is the agriculture and the insecurity, addressing that, because in agriculture, we do have a comparative advantage in things like cassava. I mean, sesame, I think we're the largest exporter of sesame to Japan is an example of a great success story. I heard about by road, we're exporting garlic out of Sokoto up into Morocco. So we can do agriculture. And the third thing we can export and earn significant foreign exchange is high value added services. Those three things taken together can really will solve our balance of payment problems. The Naira will strengthen, we'll be in a much better place. What's not going to work in the medium term is try to export manufactured goods. We're just, as I said, not competitive. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't develop manufacturing, but we should be focusing manufacturing more on import substitution. So things we import, we can now manufacture domestically.
All right. So I know there's a lot of conversation that will continue in this regard. We've seen the 8 points agenda. People want to see more of a roadmap now, want to know what the milestones will be. We have a timeline of 3 years as it is. But of course, along the way, we'll be touching base and making sure that we keep up to date and we keep them accountable and transparent with everything they say they'll do. Dr. Andrew Nevin, economist and former partner and chief economist, PwC Nigeria. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. So we're going to take a quick time out now. We have international business headlines coming your way. And then, of course, we'll be looking at records that were broken, one by the Nigerian Stock Exchange, as Nigeria's stocks recorded the highest ever level ever. We'll get into that and ask ourselves, can that momentum be sustained? Do stay with us.